When I was a doctor, and if I didn't know what was going on with the patient, with the dog, I'd just go. And then people think I was really smart and I knew what I was doing. And inside in my brain, I was going like, what the hell? If everyone you want to look intellectual, you got to get glasses.
Yeah.
My name is Reverend Dr. Loida Martell-Otero, and I am a constructive theologian at Palmer Theological Seminary in Eastern University. And there's not a lot of constructive theologians out there, which is kind of fun. Constructive theology is a branch of systematic theology. And basically what that is that systematic theology, as the name almost implies, looks at things pertaining to God in a very systematic way. Right? So you sort of almost artificially divide things up. Well, what is God? What is Jesus? What is faith? What is sin? Things like that. And constructive theologians look at those things and say, if you looked at that from a different perspective, would you come up with the same answers? And then it would ask, in fact, if you looked at it from a different way, from a different perspective, would you even ask the same questions? And if you're not asking the same questions, then what would you construct? What would it look like? And that's what constructive theologians do. So in a way, constructive theologians are the theologians that have fun, because we're constructing new things, we're generating new things. So that's what I do. And so at Palmer, I teach systematics, but I also teach things like contextual theologies and liberation theologies, and we have fun. I tell my students, this is my sandbox, this is my playground. Come with me and have fun, and let's play. So my context is I'm a Puerto Rican, and so I do, generally speaking, is Latino theologies from the perspective of Latino people residing in the U.S., primarily in the U.S. And so what does that look like? So what does theology look like from a Mexican-American perspective, or a Puerto Rican perspective, or a Cuban-American perspective, or a Dominican-American perspective? And that's where I focus on. In my particular case, because I'm a constructive theologian, I don't just remain there, right? Then I try to find connections. And so I try to familiarize myself with other contextual theologies. And so then I try to find patterns. What do we have in common with Asian North American theologians? What do we have in common, and what are the points of dialogue with womanist theologies, African American theologies, Native American theologies, and that kind of thing. But primarily the focal point is Latino theologies in the U.S. There are so many things. That's why I'm pausing. There are so many things. We are able to translate in ways that is fascinating to me. We are able to enter into two worlds at the same time. One of the things I sometimes do in class is that I will tell people, I will say something, and then I will say that the very same thing in Spanish, and then I will translate how it reads in Spanish. And instantly the students will say, I didn't see that. I didn't see that meaning. Just the fact that you translated it, I saw something totally different. So we are sometimes able to travel between two cultural and two perspectival worlds and be able to see the and. Sometimes people here in the U.S. are either or, and we are and both kinds of people. And so we're able to see both sides of things. So there's that translational ability. I have a passion for diversity, and I think the passion of diversity is because I'm very aware that as a Puerto Rican and as a Latina person, I embody many cultures within me, because it's who we are. So, for example, my father comes from Corsican peoples, so there's French blood in him, and there's Spanish blood in him, and there's African blood in him. His great-grandmother was an African slave that came on a Dutch ship. So, but her last name was Irish. So you have this mix. That's just on my father's side. On my mother's side, there's Indigenous blood and Spanish blood. And my brother is married to a Canadian woman who's German-Irish. So my nephews are now Corsican, Spanish, Indigenous, African, German, Irish, all embodied in one. And so we're very aware of that. We have this embodiment of many cultures within us. And so we are, and this is where the and both come from. And so we're very aware of this, the presence of this. And we carry the learnings and the abilities of all these cultures within us. So somehow, and when they come together in us, they don't obliterate each other. They all reside together. Virgilio Elizondo once said, we are a mix, but we're not mixed up. And I think that was very well put. Having all those cultures within us then allows us to gain insights from each one that then give us even richer insights. For example, my last sabbatical, I went to Puerto Rico, and I did some wonderful research on the indigenous people of Puerto Rico. And I began to discover all the spiritualities, indigenous spiritualities, that are alive and well in evangelica faith, that I don't even know that present-day Protestants are aware are present there, and how they're just lifted up. And so what is oftentimes called Puerto Rican time, really what that is behind that is an attentiveness to people. And so you don't rush us. We're not rushed to get someplace. We're not attentive to time because we're attentive to relationships and to people. And that comes from our indigenous roots. And so so we bring all that richness, all that wisdom, all those perspectives we bring to the table in very particular kinds of ways. And I think that enriches the conversation immensely. Sure. Well, this example that I just gave you about time, the emphasis of place and relationship over time is certainly very key. That was a very key finding, and I'll give you a good example of that. I actually wrote an article titled "My GPS doesn't work in Puerto Rico," because literally it didn't. But here's the thing: when you go to Puerto Rico and you ask for directions, somebody from the U.S. will go and you ask for directions and you expect somebody to tell you, sure, take Highway 23, and at the cross of Highway 23 with Highway 11, take a left, and at the two blocks down further, take a right, and there's your address. That's what you expect. In Puerto Rico, people will give you directions based on relationships. So this is what somebody will tell you. You see that road down there? Follow that road. That road is going to curve. It's going to curve around, and then you're going to see the mango tree, and it's going to curve the other way, and then you're going to see Pablo's bodega. When you see Pablo's bodega, there's a little drunk guy. When you see the little drunk guy, hang a left. It's the greenhouse 3 houses down from the drunk guy. And if you follow those instructions, you will find the house. If you follow the highway things, you will never find it. And it's fascinating. It's fascinating that that happens. And I grew up in that environment, and I never noticed. And I came here, and I got used to the GPS. I went back to Puerto Rico. I turned on my GPS. And where I saw neighborhoods, I knew there were neighborhoods. My GPS just showed these blue swaths. It couldn't find anything. And so I had to turn it off. And I started asking people for instructions. And people started telling me instructions like that. And I thought I'd never find it. And sure enough, I followed. It curved like this, and it curved like that, and there was the mango tree, and I followed, and there was both the bodega, the grocery store, and sure enough, there was the little drunk guy sitting on the corner, and sure enough, there was the house. And then I realized, sure, because we go by relationships. Relationships are paramount, and in Indigenous people, it was the land. Because the land represented relationships. That's where relationships took place. So it's fascinating. This book was born 10 years before it was published. I approached Zaida Maldonado and I said to Zaida, I want to write a book that talks about us because our voices are not represented in academia. And there's such a great wisdom from our people, and there's such a rich theology, and it's not being represented. And whenever I'd go to AR or to academic forums, I'd hear people say all kinds of things, and I'd sit there and I'd go, my voice, I don't find me. My voice is not here. And when I'd present, people were always trying to categorize me. Oh, you're a feminist. No, and you know that I'm not, but that's not quite it. That's not the slot I fit into. Or you're a womanist. No, that's not quite it either. Or you're a mujerista. No, that's not quite it either. And so people would say, well, what are you? I'm an evangelica. Oh, what's that? And I'd have to go through the whole explanation. And so I approached Zaida and I said, let's write this book. And she said, okay, as soon as you're done with your PhD, let's write this book. And I had written an article some years earlier, which, I didn't know what I was doing, really, but it was the seed of this. So I had written an article, I think sometime like in 1994, and I was the one who coined the term evangelica. That was the first time it would have ever been used as a category of theology. I mean, everybody in Latin America knows the word evangelica. I don't pretend to have invented that word. But to use it specifically as a category of theology, I was the one who coined it in that way. So we went to publishers, and everybody said, initially people said, what is that? Is that like mujerista theology? And I said, no. And initially people went, well, we're not interested. And finally somebody said, yes, we're interested, and we want these changes done to your proposal, and we made the changes. And they said, it's good to go. And after a year of them telling us they were going to send us the contract, they said, we decided not to publish it, and they didn't send the contract. And so this happened a couple of times, and 10 years went by. And in 2010, I sat down with a woman named Ulrike Guthrie, and she asked me, whatever happened to your book? And I said, I gave up on it. We're not mujerista. We're not Catholic. We're not feminist. We're not womanist. And so we're not fitting the categories, the preset categories. So I've given up on this. I'm going to move on to something else. And she said, send me the proposal. And I said, no, that's okay. Send me the proposal. I said, okay, I respect you. So I sent her the proposal, and she sent it to Cascade. And within 2 weeks, Cascade contacted me. And they said, we need your names and addresses to send you the contract. And I think 48 hours later, we had a contract. And 3 years later, we had the book. So I'm very thankful to Ulrike Guthrie, and I'm very thankful to Cascade for seeing what others had not seen 10 years earlier. I'm sorry it took that long to publish, but we persisted. Here's the thing, and here's what's fascinating. When I wanted to publish that book 10 years earlier, and people were resistant, I used to tell them this. I'm writing a book for an audience that is not here yet. But in 10 years, this audience will be there. There's going to be a growing Protestant Evangelica group of PhD. They're not there yet because we're bringing them in. But in 10 years, they're going to be in the PhD programs. There's going to be a critical mass in the MDiv programs, and they're going to be looking for this book. And that's the audience I'm writing for. And they didn't believe me. And this past summer, I taught at the Hispanic Summer Program. It's the second time I teach for them. And I'm sitting in the dining room, and the student comes up to me and says, Dr. Martell, I've been wanting to meet you because I read your book, and I said, oh my gosh, this is me. I finally found a book that is me. He says, you have written a book about my theology, about my grandmother, about my roots, and I'm so excited. I bought the book for my grandmother. And I said, wow, thank you. And then another student came up to me and said, Dr. Martell? I said, yes. This book is about me. You wrote this book about me. It's so exciting to find a book that talks about my theology and about my community. And this happened 4 or 5 times. And suddenly I looked out and I said, that community that I said 13 years ago that was going to happen in 10 years, they're already here. They're here now. Nobody saw them coming, but I did see them coming. And here now they're beyond the MDiv programs. They're already in the PhD programs, right? And that's very exciting for me to see. I'll say a little something about the book cover.
Yeah.
The person who at the time was in charge of the book cover sent us a book cover, and I looked at it and I said, oh my goodness, I don't know how to tell this person. She did so much effort to find this book cover. I don't know how to tell her that this book cover doesn't quite reflect this book. But I emailed her and I said, this book cover doesn't quite reflect this book. So I've taken up photography. I've been looking at your Nikons because I love photography, and I have a Nikon. So I sent the person a photo of this. I had taken a photo of a woman praising in a Evangelica church, and she just evoked so well the spirit of what we were talking about. So I sent the person this photo, and I said, I'm not sending you this photo to use as a cover. I'm not that good. I don't pretend to you to do that, and I don't have the person's permission anyway. But it's just to show you, to sort of evoke what the spirit is about. And I said a little bit about the book, and we didn't hear back from her, and I said to the other 2 co-authors, I think I offended her. Oh my goodness, I hope I didn't offend her. Because we're, in the Puerto Rican community at least, again, because of those indigenous roots, the issue of honor, of not dishonoring somebody is very important, right? You never have somebody lose face. So I was afraid that I had maybe made her lose face. And about 3 weeks later, she contacted me with the cover that you see on that book. And she said, I'm so sorry I took time, but I searched all of the internet and I could not find a cover that represented what you explained to me. So I painted an original painting for your cover. And here it is. I hope you liked it. And I wept. I really did. that only Cascade would do that. So, I mean, it waited 10 years because it had to be a Kairos time. It had to be that relationships are important. It had to be that relationship. It couldn't have been any other place to have published that book. For about 2 months, every time I'd look at this book, at the cover, I'd weep. But it would just because I'd be so moved that she would do that. I mean, who does that? To actually paint, to do an original artwork like that. And she captured it. I mean, she captured it. Yeah, it's amazing. Evangelica is, the reason I coined that word is because we come out of a Protestant tradition. When the United States invaded, there's another word, invaded the Americas, in Spanish-speaking Americas, following the military routes, so followed the missionaries. And so they brought Protestantism to the Americas. What missionaries didn't realize is that there was already Christianity, or maybe they realized it, but they didn't acknowledge the Christianity that was already there. It was a Catholicism, but it wasn't European Catholicism. It was an Iberian Catholicism. So it was a Catholicism that came from Spain and from Portugal. But it was a Catholicism that encountered already indigenous spiritualities, African spiritualities, other kinds of spiritualities that were already there. Plus, the Christianity from Spain had already been influenced by Moors and by Jews. So it was it was a cross between Semitic influences and Catholicism. So here's this mix, right, that then encounters indigenous and mixes. And it became what Latino Catholics call a popular Catholicism. There weren't a lot of priests, so it became almost a self-sustained kind of faith. And that's the Christian faith that these missionaries came to. And so when they encountered that faith and they started preaching to people, what happened was that the Catholics that so-called converted to Protestantism didn't so much convert to Protestantism as much as that they also had Protestantism convert as well. So it became this distinctive blend, right? The same way I told you that I embody all these cultures, the Protestant faith embodies all these other spiritualities. And that's why the indigenous spiritualities live through this. So it's a Protestantism, but it's a distinctive it's a popular Protestantism. And so I don't want to call it evangelicalism, because evangelicalism in the States has these very distinctive political connotations to that term that doesn't exist in Spanish, in the Spanish-speaking world. So in the Spanish-speaking world, when you ask somebody in Spanish, are you Catholic? They will respond to you, no, soy evangelica, soy evangelico. And what they're saying is, I'm a Protestant. No, I'm not Catholic, I'm a Protestant. But the word in Spanish, Protestant, means to protest. So for them to say, soy protestante, there's an implication I'm protesting. And that doesn't make any sense in Spanish. But when they say, soy evangelica, soy evangelico, the root word to that is evangelion, which means good news. And the way that in the 19th century, in the early 20th century, when Protestantism came to Latin America, the way that Protestants distinguished themselves from Catholics was that Catholics didn't read Bible. That was a stereotype. Catholics didn't read Bible, and Protestants did. So Protestants came to be known as the people of the book. So they were the evangelicos, the people of the book, the people of the good news. So we came to be known as the Evangelicos. So when I started talking about Evangelica theology, I wanted to say, yes, this is a Protestant theology, but it's not evangelical. But it's also not U.S. Europeanized Protestantism either. It's that popular Protestantism that has those Moorish, Indigenous, Catholic, African, all those things embodied, right? To have this unique blend. So it's a Protestant faith that is deeply rooted, that has this deep spirituality, right? So the Holy Spirit is very important for us. It's this deep spirituality. But it's a deep spirituality that is very rooted in the everydays. So Orlando Speen, who's a Catholic, will talk about this sacramental worldview. And sometimes that doesn't make any sense in the U.S. God is manifested in the things of the everyday. So you can have somebody, and I've seen this happen. A woman will go into a laundromat and start washing clothes, and she'll watch the thing spinning around, and all of a sudden she'll go, God is like that washing machine. Life will toss you around, but the blood of Jesus will wash you clean in that process. And no matter what knocks you about, when you come out clean because God is with you in the midst of that. That's that sacramental worldview, that God is in the midst of that. And it's not surprising at all for somebody to be looking for a parking, and I know of a colleague that this happened to. She was looking for a parking, and she said, God, please supply a parking spot. And suddenly a parking spot opened up, and she pulled in. Oh, thank you, God, for this parking spot. Well, she was with a white woman who said, oh, that's silly. That's so superstitious. God doesn't supply parking spots. And my colleague looked at this. My friend looked at her colleague and said, well, maybe your God doesn't supply parking spots, but in my case, God knows that I have 2 little children, and my husband is handicapped. And God knows that I have to carry 3 people, and that if I don't pray for a parking spot, then I have to carry from very far away with 3 people in my arms. So God, in God's grace, works with me in my need of every day. So when I pray for a parking spot, God will supply for a parking spot. If God is not supplying you for a parking spot because you don't pray for it, that's your problem. So don't put your stuff on me and the other car. Right? So, but what that really is a manifestation of this sacramental worldview, that God is present in the spaces of the everyday. So that is part of that Evangelica ideology, right? So it's a Protestantism, but it's a popular Protestantism that has all these intricate roots to it, and so it's fascinating. So we're not Catholic, we're not quite Protestant the way people here are Protestant, right? But it's a living faith, and it's a joyful faith. It's one filled with song. My father's a pastor, and he said the Latino people are a walking piece of music. They're always singing their faith. Yes. Abuelita, of course, means grandmother, literally grandmother. And so what we meant by Abuelita theologies is the fact that our Christianity and who we are today, our theological formation, comes out of the community. And so it's this inherited faith. So the fact is that it does come from all these roots that go way back, right? So how far back do we need to go back enough? We don't. So it's a faith that's formed in this communal way. There is no individuality, right? And it's interesting, at least in Puerto Rico, I don't know about other cultures, but in Puerto Rico, the word for individual is a pejorative term. When somebody says este individuo, this individual, That's somebody who's very selfish and thinking and very narcissistic. So that's fascinating, right? So it's a very communal kind of society. So to say Abuelita theologies is this acknowledgement that this is a theology that isn't that didn't just come up by one person or by two or three people who decided to come around and invent something. That this really is something that comes out of the formation of a community, of a larger community that has been passed down. My theological formation came from my Sunday school teachers and from the preaching from the pulpit and from the things I heard at home and so on and so forth. In my particular case, I have an interesting history in that on my mother's side, I'm a third-generation Baptist. On my father's side, he converted from Catholicism, but then he became a Baptist minister. He's an ordained clergy. So in New York City, in specific, the Martell is part of a sort of little... is part of I don't want to use the word dynasty because that's just a horrendous word, but it's part of a circle of families that became well known for their leadership in the Baptist churches. My co-author, Conde Frazier, her family was part of that leadership. There was a group of Baptist churches that were founded in New York City, and there was a group of families that were part of those founding families that became leaders. And so my family was part of that leadership. In fact, I was the quiet one. I was the shy little kid. My brother was a leader. My grandmother was a Sunday school teacher. My mother was a Sunday school teacher. My father was, of course, then chosen to be an ordained clergy. I was the black sheep of the family. I went off and became a veterinarian. So I guess I'm like Amos. God called me from the fields. And so this was a late kind of decision to enter into the ministry. I think it took all of us by surprise, mostly me. So I learned a lot of things from good pastors, from good Sunday school teachers. And so my theological training is not so much that it taught me theology, but it gave me the tools to critically assess theology, and so to be able to then think creatively and playfully as a constructive theologian. But I am forever grateful for the roots that Sunday school and good pastors gave me in that. And it's still rooted in that. I mean, I need that community of faith to keep me real, right? I still go back and make sure that I haven't gone off the deep end. Right? You can get too theoretical. You can get too critical. If you want to know if your theology is rooted in reality and in flesh and blood, then go back to that community and see what's happening and talk with people and walk with people. In the way you posed the question, I would have to say no because of what I just finished saying, because there was such a large community. But in terms of people who have been a touchstone in my life, I think, and it probably comes through in the book, I think Orlando Costas is one of those important voices in my life because he was doing some very important work when I arrived at Andover Newton, and he was dean of Andover Newton when he recruited me to go to Andover Newton. Interestingly enough, I only had him for one semester, and then he went off to sabbatical, and subsequently was diagnosed with cancer and died less than a year later. But here's what's interesting. I became very good friends with his family and with his daughter. In fact, you can edit this out, but I officiated the wedding of his oldest daughter. We became very good friends with the family. And so I had occasion to enter in some good theological conversation with his family. What became, I think, very influential was that when he went on sabbatical, there were some conversations that he had initiated at Andover. And in his absence, they asked me, as a Latina student, to engage in some conversations with the faculty. And they asked an African-American student to represent the African-American students to engage with the faculty. And in the process of those conversations with the faculty in his absence, is that I began to appreciate what he was trying to do at Andover Newton and what he was trying to do in theology. And I kept telling people, I can hardly wait until Orlando comes back so I can tell him, I get it. I get it. And the time he was supposed to come back was when he was diagnosed, and he came back and went straight to the hospital. And from there got so gravely ill that I was never able to tell him what I wanted to tell him. And then he passed away. So, in a sense, part of what I do is my ways, my cosmic way of telling Orlando, I got it. Wherever you are, I got it. And I'm doing these things because I got it. So in that way, he's been an influence and a voice in me. But certainly there are other people, my colleagues, Elizabeth Conde Frazier is a good dialogue partner with me, and we bounce things off of each other. I've got wonderful colleagues at Palmer who are colleagues and friends who I engage with as well. I read widely, and not just Latino stuff. As I said, I make sure that I read, other groups. And in the past 5 years, I've been really delving into Native American theologies to make sure that I understand that as well. So all those things have been very much an influence in me and forming in me. But my vision always is to be as diverse and as open and as I possibly can be, and always be sensitive to the leading and the speaking of the Spirit, and to make sure that I don't do to others what was done to me as a child, which is to ignore me, marginalize me, and make me invisible. Because that's what happened to me when I was in New York. I've always been short and that, not anymore, but when I was a kid, skinny, and so people automatically thought, I guess because I was Latina, she's dumb, she's got nothing to say, she's not worth it. And so I was the kid that people just automatically ignored. So I think in a way I've always spent my life making sure that people are not in corners, people are not ignored, and people are not invisible. And I was telling somebody the other day, my ministry in a sense is about being very acutely aware of the presence of absence and the absent, the absence of those present. So amid those who are present. And I think that that's what's very critical for me in my ministry and in my writing and in my theological formation. So whenever I write and I do theology, I'm always asking, who's not here? Who's not being heard? And who's being affected by those who are speaking? And how are they being affected? And even the things that I'm writing, who did I miss? And how is it what I'm writing affecting others? Yes, this next project, which is exploring Latino theologies, is going to be very interesting for me, because first of all, it's going to free me of footnotes. No, I'm kidding. Second, it's a good book because what it's going to be written for is for college students, Bible institutes, and for people who probably are not familiar with Latino theologies and want to just get a snapshot of what this is about. And so it's going to have, hopefully, a wider audience. This is not to say that Latina Evangélicas didn't have a wide audience. And let me just say as an aside, I was fascinated when Latina Evangélicas was first published, because the very, very first 2 emails that I got about that book were from 2 white men who resonated so deeply with it. So I think that this next book is meant to be for a wider audience, though, as an introduction, so that people can know what Latino theologies are about. What I think is going to be interesting about this, and how I hope to write this out, is that we often think about Latino theologies in terms of Christianity. We have often made the stereotype that Hispanic people are Catholic primarily. I lived in Alabama for 4 years when I was doing my veterinary degree. I was at Tuskegee. And whenever people meet me and they found out that I was Baptist, they go, "You're not Catholic?" I go, "No, I'm Baptist." So there's this stereotype that if you're a Latino, you're Catholic, or at the very least, you're Christian. And one of the things that I hope to do in this book is to break that stereotype, because one of the chapters I hope to be able to do in this book is to introduce the fact that we have a growing Latino Muslim community, and to sort of widen that conversation and talk about Latino theologies that include hopefully some interfaith dialogue in there. So I think that's going to be a little bit different and a little exciting, and hopefully that'll get people to talk and to get to know the Latino community in its broader diversity. And again, to make present maybe voices that had been absent from the dialogical table up to now.